This is the quarterly update video for the ARS SIG. I'm Samir.
I'm Bomani.
So, a quick introduction to our project. The overall goal of our research was to really improve the ARS methodology mentioned in the DTR grant. We particularly looked at research scaffolding originally, in particular, like resource suggestion for novice researchers using the algorithm suggested in the task genius paper. However, the algorithm suggested to use recycled stories and plans, and the quality of these from last quarter were not what we wanted to make an effective algorithm. So we've shifted our focus after need finding towards scaffolding for high-level planning and suggesting curated best practices. This change was also supported by the DTR grant on this page that learners really lack scaffolds for planning effectively on their own. While like sprint review does help, learners regularly miss opportunities to review details and sequences of tasks to achieve higher level deliverables, as well as miss guidance on predicted effort estimates for tasks that are accurate.
Our system seeks to provide researchers with scaffolds for high-level planning and best research practices that are low effort and independent of research effort areas. So for high-level planning, our system provides scaffolds to promote awareness of overall research direction and progress. And for best practices, our system provides template stories and tasks, questions, and advice to provide or promote clear, concise, actionable, and value-delivering plans. So initially, when looking into the reuse strategy, we started by going through the task genius paper. So here we learned a lot about text matching, as well as some other, sort of learning science related topics. And the first thing that we wanted to do to get started on implementing this general algorithm was actually scraping all of the sprint plans. So we went ahead and wrote some code to scrape the data from the sprint plans and store this all in a MongoDB database on MongoLab. We used a library called gspread to get all of the data from the spreadsheets, and essentially this just accepts the link to the quarterly dashboard and then scrapes every project within that quarter. You can see the data on our MongoLab account here. As you can see, there's basically information about different aspects of the story. So for example, we'll have the status, word sense disambiguation, fields, as well as points, hours, assignees, and so on. The next thing that we sort of tried out was actually a Wizard of Oz testing. So while we were doing this, we started by actually using a chat window to simulate what it might be like to have a person chat with the user and give advice using that methodology. And so we essentially just had user testing sessions where we put helpful advice, links, best practices directly into a chat window under the alias of DTR bot. And so we found that this was pretty interesting. There were some things that made the tests a little bit harder to evaluate. For example, people didn't notice that the chat bar was even there. But the people that did look at the content there found it to be pretty helpful, especially with the advice, and especially when going over stories that they felt were more difficult or they didn't have much experience with.
Okay, so for the next part, we really focused on the matching. So we used the PyWSD library to do word and disambiguation. So this library just takes words and finds like the sense of them, what they really mean. So like a word like make can have 40 senses. So what we do with these senses after we break down stories and tasks is that we match them using maximum weight bipartite matching as suggested in the task genius paper. So we used the network X library to do this, and we just went through and we compared every task to the input task that the user gave for the search so that we can match them based off this. We also included DTR phrases such as, or even coding phrases such as like react or parse or storyboarding that didn't show up in the word sense disambiguation libraries. So after we did this, we came up with an interface. So our interface for this is the task query. So right here you can see we do user interviews. The number of results are there, and then we submit a post, and then it shows up with the stories that match. So that's the story that matched. The points are shown on the match at the end, and then the task specifically that matched was highlighted in green. So the first two are actually the same, but they matched on two different tasks. And then story 3 is different. And you can see inside are the person, the points, the hours, and the status. And we tested on this, and people found like information about points and status useful, but we also saw that it was not that accurate. But we can do a quick demo right now. Maybe just typing in.
So we could do something like test iOS application with 5 users, for example.
Yeah.
Submit our post. Wait a little while, and we get the results back on this end. So as you can see, these are sort of the match scores over here and different stories that we get. Some of this stuff is, we find that, it does match on some of the words, and, some of this stuff could be useful, but generally, like the way that the tasks and stories are written, it could generally sort of just be too vague for people to really look through and get a lot of learning out of by themselves. So to move forward from there, we did some paper prototyping.
So for paper prototyping, we tried to test not only the interface for matching tasks and stories and like really like pushing that through the paper prototype, but we also tried testing something called DTR gurus, which was like suggesting people to help each other and have a site for that. This is just like a quick paper prototype that we did. We'll just scroll through and we can watch it a little bit.
I want you to use the system to do a search, and then I'll present some information. You can like move down the task.
Assuming I don't have this knowledge.
Yeah.
Okay.
Just kind of like talk aloud about what you're seeing and
Okay. So what this looks like is a list of stories from other people who have searched for related.
Okay, so this was just similar task and story suggestion, and we were just testing the interface out.
So kind of after learning the things we learned from the testing sessions, both on the interface for the text matching and with the paper prototypes, we decided that we kind of needed to redo some need finding and really sort of hone in on what part of this overall project we really wanted to focus on. So to do that, we started by putting together a project decision matrix where we essentially laid out all of the things that we felt could be potential directions for the project, and then measured tech feasibility, time and effort, usefulness, and then our own personal interest for each one of these things. After filling out this decision matrix, we found that we really wanted to focus on resources and best practices for helping people to successfully execute their sprint plan. And at that point, we kind of started to move forward in that direction.
After we did this, we really decided that we needed to do more need finding. We felt that we didn't know enough about our users, so we conducted a class survey in DTR on one of the Fridays. What we really wanted to figure out was we asked about plan. We really figured out what we want to learn is how people plan, and then what they're good at in terms of DTR skills, as well as what they find as weaknesses. We asked a short 6-question survey, and as well as the last question, how do you get help? So people just filled this out, and what we really learned from this is that that people need help with high-level planning. They felt that they didn't know their research direction, as well as project direction as a whole, maybe even how their research contributes to their field, as well as we noticed that sometimes, even in terms of planning, that students didn't use best practices, and that's something that we felt we needed to focus on. So we focused both on best practices and high-level planning for the next steps. Okay, so we then, based off this, Hauchi had suggested for us to look at the socially shared planning paper. So we looked at the socially uh, shared planning section of this paper, which suggested not only just suggested questions to ask to promote SSLR learning and um, as well as we're going to pull it up right here. So here we go. So these kind of questions are like, describe your current tasks, what is the purpose, what is the goal, describe what you need to do to achieve your goal, what is the main challenge, what are you going to do as a group to overcome this challenge. These questions really like help you like plan and see if you want to actually do the thing that you're supposed to do and really think about it before you actually start executing and doing your work. So we made a survey for this, and we also included a best practices section, but the survey was kind of our high fidelity, low fidelity mock-up that we wanted to test just to get it out there quickly. So we did a general story plan. We asked most of these questions, actually made it a little bit more specific to DTR, so like stories and tasks. And we also did best practices. So we did user testing / interview planning. How do you run your user interview and test? How many users do you want to interview? How you record your session, just to get people to start thinking about best practices. We even did tech implementation and just like writing out your specific blockers and plans to help you build your tech. We found that we got good results. Actually, it was actually surprising. People wrote better tasks in our survey than they did on their sprint planning sheet, but users were very apprehensive in the sense that they told us that they wouldn't have done it unless it was a test, and there was a lot of like overhead.
So kind of moving forward with our design process, we decided to focus in on actually just taking what we felt would be the most important parts of that questionnaire and integrating into that into the sprint planning tool. So we added some scaffolding here so that when someone does type in a story, these two questions pop up underneath. And so these questions just take what we felt were kind of the most important mental prompters about high-level planning from the survey, and just has students answer these per story each time that they are sprint planning. So the first one is just, what is the purpose of the story? The second is, what is the outcome for this story? So what would the deliverable look like? And we think that these two questions really get people thinking about the worth and the value of what they're trying to accomplish within each one of the stories. The next thing that we decided to also do while testing was have a best practices bar. So this best practices bar we had sort of lay on the side of the interface here. And basically this just allowed people to kind of go through. So as you're writing a story, if you find that one of your stories fits one of these high-level areas for suggestions of best practices, you just click on it. So for example, user testing, you can see that we have a gold standard story here that suggests points and tasks, and also these windows that allow you for you to sort of change some of the aspects of the task that we're suggesting, as well as the points. So for example, if you wanted to recruit 5 users and each interview is going to take 30 minutes, then you can update these things here to go ahead and see the points change. So for example, 10 users, the points goes up a little bit. And we hope that these would be sort of very simple, promote sort of the semantic values that we think are important for tasks, and also just be something that you can kind of copy and paste directly into your sprint plan as well. We also have a food for thought section on some of these that talks about some of, doesn't have answer fields, but just prompts students to think about some of the other best practices that we think are important for this general area. So in the case of user interviews and testing, asking how you might get more helpful and unbiased results is just a good thing to have in your mind as you're designing the test. So we did this for a few different major areas. We also included some links as well, and we think that this would be a really cool thing to extend just to give people sort of a really boiled down way of viewing these tasks. Another affordance that we added on the sprint planning tool, kind of in conjunction, was a marker for when you have sort of large point values. And so we highlight point values that are 5 or greater in red, essentially to tell people that they might want to break down the stories a little bit more. And we also included this column for task and story roadblocks. And so this is just an optional section that students can fill out if they feel that something is going to be blocking them from successfully completing a task that they laid out in the story. And this, kind of going back into the socially shared planning paper, we think will be helpful in getting novice researchers to think about, issues beforehand so that they can address them before it's too late.
So we're going to go over kind of our key design ideas at this point in the quarter. I'm going to go over high-level planning. So in terms of high-level planning, we wanted to have it be really low-effort integration. It doesn't take too much time. We noticed in the class survey for original quick Google form prototype was that if it was too much overhead, people were not interested. It was too much. They felt it was redundant. We want it to be flexible and agnostic to the research field so that it doesn't matter what you're really researching on. The high-level solution or plan that we want to make will account for that, and it will be general enough, while also specific enough to help you out on your high-level plan. And then we also just want to promote awareness of research direction and progress, really through high-level planning. High-level planning for people are difficult, and our system is not supposed to tell you what your high-level plan is. Instead, it's supposed to help you be aware of what you want to do next in your project.
And so similarly for best practices, we had a couple of similar design ideas. Firstly, that we also think it should be really low effort to integrate these best practices into your workflow, which is why we kind of wanted to make sure that everything would be really easily copyable, and we think we can extend down that path in the future even more. We also do want the best practices to be sort of agnostic to the research, to the specific type of research that you're doing. So someone who's kind of in the research studio doing one type of user test versus another will hopefully still see value in the same user testing best practice that we've suggested, similarly for prototyping technology and so on. And then lastly, we feel that the best practices should be really clear, concise, actionable, and should deliver value. And so when people do check out the gold standard stories, we really want them to be able to see value in using them and to trust the fact that these are actually worthwhile tasks that we think will help to make the research they're doing higher impact.
Yeah, so our next steps for a quarter are we really want to dig deeper into our design arguments for high-level planning and best practices. We spent time on research suggestion this quarter, and we want to because we pivoted, we want to really dig deep again into the design arguments for these things.
We also want to really sort of start to understand the contributions of our research on the technical systems and conceptual levels. And so we think that as we're doing research and kind of putting together a good tool, it's just helpful to keep these things in mind to understand how the things we're learning could be generalizable.
And we want to also implement these high-level planning questions on the Google Sheet for next quarter just to see how they will test out. We're going to suggest a few things to have cheap for next quarter for the sprint planning sheet.
And another thing that we want to think about is as a sort of system for authoring best practices. So we put together all of these ones in the sidebar, but thinking about how we can make this more extensible and how we can include other members of the research studio in the creation of these best practices would be really helpful, especially for people to create and revise these tasks.
The last possible next step we're thinking is redesigning and creating a sprint planning tool because we wanted to include a few more affordances like best practices as well as maybe even roadblocks or asking more questions. So how we can best do that is something we might think about next quarter.
Sweet, thank you.
Thanks.